Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're going to be talking about the newest album from Reba McEntire called Sing It Now, Songs of Faith and Hope. I gotta be honest, I don't even know where to start with this. When I first saw this come up on Patreon on my schedule, I literally went to the guy who requested it and asked politely if I could just skip it or if he could ask for something else. Anything else. And I figured I'd have good ground with it. After all, it's a selection of traditional religious hymns. That's not something that any critic normally covers. And there's a very good reason for that, given that the music on an album like this is normally secondary at best, with instead the main purpose being for worship. And again, that's not saying that music can't have religious themes, but when you considering the art of it all, you're left scrabbling for something that's often not even as relevant, especially on a lyrical level when it comes to traditional hymns. There are, of course, exceptions. But in this certain brand of evangelical gospel, poetry, writing, they often take a backseat to the conviction of the performer, and that doesn't interest me. But then it was pointed out to me that there was indeed an entire second disc full of original religious songs, and I still wasn't very satisfied with this. My overall point still stands. But then I thought, well, hey, this is Reba McEntire, the country artist who managed to survive the overly sanitized 80s in order to become one of the most impressive and long-running hit makers in the 90s. There would undoubtedly be some quality here, and hell, I even stand behind her self-titled TV show as being a lot smarter and well-written than so many people gave it credit for a multi-camera sitcom. And she was an expressive actress and performer. And it wasn't like there wasn't a demand for this album either. It debuted at number 4 on the Billboard 200. It sold tens of thousands of copies. People are clearly interested. And hell, I still have faith, even though my own view of it is a lot more complex and layered as what you would typically see on evangelical parishes. You're gonna get a lot into that, so strap in. So maybe this record could move me despite my extreme skepticism going in. So are these songs of faith and hope up to that challenge? Well, okay, here's the thing. The more I listen through this double album, the more I'm convinced that it really can and should be viewed as two separate projects. The first part, as I described, are the traditional hymns, and it's where the majority of what I described above feels most appropriate. In other words, the sort of devotional music where artistic criticism doesn't really have the same weight or impact or anyone will care about it, especially when it comes to the writing. The second disc, on the other hand, it plays to a much more contemporary religious audience, much more in the spirit of modern Christian music than a lot of the hymns. And that means I got no qualms to take the gloves off, because while Reba does hit some high notes that I will give her credit for, there are definitely songs that deserve some harsher analysis. And again, fair warning, I'm coming at these tracks from a slightly unorthodox Christian point of view. If you're not religious or you abhor the idea of religious music, I'm not gonna say there's nothing for you here in terms of good songs or art, but I will say that I found certain elements of this project pretty damn preachy. If I thought that, you're gonna find this insufferable, especially if you get more of a virulent atheist streak. And this is the other thing. It's going to be impossible for me to adequately articulate my rationale behind any response to this music without sharing some aspects of my faith and attitudes towards organized religion. Namely that despite being raised Catholic, I find the structure of the religious congregation doesn't enhance or strengthen any faith experience that I might have. My relationship with a higher power is intimate, it's personal. The sort of connection that I find most manifests itself through quiet humility more than the soaring gospel choirs or bombast. That's why I hold Jason Isbell's God is a Working Man as arguably one of the best religious songs that I've heard in the past couple of years. It emphasizes the quiet humanity that came through Jesus' human connection with the world, the unknowable nature of modern miracles, and the aspect of quiet support that doesn't need or demand or ask for any grand statement. I really appreciate that. Now, what I mean by all this is that while I can definitely appreciate the musicality and swell of some strains of evangelical gospel, for it to have greater resonance for me, it needs to have a little bit more homegrown, earthy, small-town grit. Think the final song on Southern Family, for example. And thus, when we consider some cuts that Reba includes on this double album, she's building to a brassier, more polished brand of country gospel on songs like Oh How I Love Jesus, Oh Happy Day, and the Swing Low Sweet Chariot medley that, look, I can see it working for some audiences, but if I'm being honest, it doesn't really connect for me. Now, I'm not surprised at all by this. Throughout her history in country, Reba's always touched into broader, more bombastic theatricality that normally works for this brand of gospel. More often than not for me, it doesn't have the organic texture to really stick, even despite some decent organ and fiddle tones. Granted, you could also make the statement about the majority of the country instrumentation and production on this album. This is very much a polished, mainstream-friendly record, even to the point where you're starting to hear modern drum machines on songs like Back to God or Angel on My Shoulder, or more Christian-friendly orchestral swell on songs like Sing It Out or From the Inside Out, or even the buzzy hints of synth around Say a Prayer that feel a little bit too sanitized and synthetic and honestly kind of plastic for me. It doesn't do a lot for me, especially coming from that very modern Christian rock point of view. Now, that's not saying that there aren't some more restrained cuts that do work for me. Mostly on the first disc, like the fiddle, pedal steel, and piano of Jesus Loves Me, or In the Garden, Wonderful Peace, or the acoustic guitar and gentle accordion of the cover of Amazing Grace, or especially the restrained atmosphere of How Great Thou Art. Hell, I could even get behind some of the more traditional banjo, rollick, and the fiddle of I'll Fly Away, even if I do wish the production picked up a little bit more organic bite to match some of the warmer textures there. And yeah, a big part of this, it's Reba herself. There's a reason that she's been celebrated in country music for decades now. Her vocal tone and expressiveness gives her earnestness a ton of bountiful charisma. That means I find it hard to outright condemn or dislike any song here. And while, of course, I'll have a soft side for the darker blend of her fire spitting that showed up on her classic songs like Fancy, she's still just as credible in this lane, and she can easily hold her own opposite Kelly Clarkson and Trisha Yearwood when they team up for Softly and Tenderly at the end of the first disc, and that song features a really cute flute interlude of all things that, yeah, I really did like. Now, all that being said, even despite some of the stiffer program percussion, the song that really caught me off guard in a good way was Angel Singin', mostly because it plays in darker, minor keys, the more folk-inspired melodic cadence, and Reba just nails the intensity. It's easily the best original song here. Now, granted, another reason for that song works for me is the lyrical subject matter. And as I said earlier, the majority of my focus here will be on the original compositions, that second disc. There's not really a lot to be said about the hymns on the first disc, most of which either fall into passable or mostly good territory. Not quite great or on the level of my favorites, for as much as you can say that. Now, as I've said in my previous videos, one of my biggest issues with modern Christian and especially evangelical music is that it's written from a perspective that's either relentlessly sanitized and always knowing the answer, or a very confrontational brand of preaching to the non-believers that often does far more to alienate than actually convince people. Now, for me, the intimacy of faith requires acceptance of humanity's flaws and failings, particularly within oneself, and that's a huge factor of why Angel Singin' works for me. It's an acknowledgement that at one's darkest moments and at one's failures and conflicted emotions, one's faith can sustain you to face sin and not turn away. The best religious songs that get to the roots of that very human drama of that faith and belief when confronting the rest of the world. And it's a damn shame that more of this record doesn't grasp that sort of nuance. At its best, we get innocuous songs like God and My Girlfriends, which seems like a stab at making a religious-themed girl power anthem, believe it or not. Or you get songs like Hallelujah Heartache, or the increasingly broad I Got the Lord on My Side, which plays to a mode of thanking God for everything, but never dares to tap into any real darkness, especially in the compositions. But at its worst, we get the Leanne Womack cover, There Is a God, which decided to take swipes at scientists who just can't get the God-given marvels of the natural world and simply write things off as probability, which, given that I have a science degree, is a maddening simplification of the actual situation here and how one can contextualize science and religion in the same case. Or then you get songs like Back to God, which goes for the sort of self-flagellation of prayer will solve everything that I just cannot stand. Mostly because it completely ignores the fact that God gives us the capacity to fight against evils of the world if you want to drive change. You have that power within yourself and God give it to you. But what bothers me more than most is that reportedly Reba was driven to make a gospel project finally because of her renewed faith after her divorce. And yet we see so little of that real detail and change and growth manifest itself on this album. I know that Reba has seldom ever written her own songs, but on the back half of this record, she had a real opportunity to tell a faith-driven story with personal detail, and yet we only get a single writer's credit on an otherwise conventional country song that wouldn't be out of place on most mainstream country projects, which only further pushes away that feeling of intimacy that for me has always underscored the sort of spiritual pursuit. I wanted to hear that greater connection to Reba's faith journey, and I didn't really get it. So to summarize all this, Look, I find it hard to rate a record like this, even when ignoring the artistry of it all and just placing it within the context of my own personal faith and whether or not it resonates. The overall intent of this record like this, especially on the first disc, is to capture that religious resonance with the audience. And there's a lot of this album that just didn't get there for me. But that's because my own faith doesn't fall into a conventional niche like most people, like most of the audience. But at the same time, just like any theme to which I cannot directly relate, the best art and music can transcend those boundaries. And while I don't doubt that Reba is throwing herself into this with the best of intentions, the production, the writing don't really approach that faith experience in a way that challenges or hits any sort of deeper insight. The second disc arguably does take more risks, but it also hits a lot more low points by playing to bad tropes in modern Christian music, with the exception of Angels Singin', again, the best song here. In short, for me, I'm giving it a light 6 out of 10, but it feels weird even grading an album like this. Most critics won't even cover this. If you're a fan of Reba and a big fan of Jesus, you'll probably like it a lot more than I do, but as it is, it's the sort of niche side project that plays to a very specific audience, and it's more fit to satisfy than challenge them. And while I could make a very snide comment comparing that such intention to modern religion, to each their own. You like it, enjoy it. Otherwise, don't waste your time. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I got the poll up here, so for all you who think that I totally misrepresented the religious element, there's your opportunity to tell me. If you want to buy the album to support her, links in the description below. As I said, religion and me, I've got a complicated relationship with it more than most people. I've given it a lot of thought. And when it goes for such broad strokes like Reba does here, it doesn't resonate. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, and I'm sure you guys have plenty of comments after that little mini diatribe I just went on. But beyond that, if you guys want to have input into that schedule, the link to my Patreon is right there, where 3 times a week you get to vote, and once a week you guys get to choose and add an album to my schedule in the higher Patreon rankings. More details, links right there. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.